Good evening. Tonight, we gather to uncover a truth that has been buried beneath millennia of marble statues, epic poems, and Hollywood adaptations. The truth about Greek heroes, those legendary figures we've been taught to admire and emulate. But what if I told you that these so-called champions of virtue and strength lived lives so cursed, so filled with suffering and betrayal, that their very existence was a testament to the cruelest joke the gods ever played on mortals? Tonight, we will strip away the golden veneer of heroism and reveal the blood-soaked reality beneath. We will witness how divine jealousy turned triumph into torment, how fate itself conspired against those who dared to be great, and how the very gifts that made these heroes legendary became the instruments of their destruction. This is not the sanitized mythology you learned in school. This is the raw, unforgiving truth about what it truly meant to be a hero in ancient Greece. Before we dive into these tragic tales, leave a comment telling me which country you are watching from and what time it is. Imagine we are all gathered as storytellers under the same stars, sharing the pain and fate of these cursed heroes, connected across time and space by these ancient wounds that still echo through eternity. To understand the true horror of being a Greek hero, we must first understand the nature of the gods they served. These were not benevolent deities watching over humanity with love and compassion. No, the Greek pantheon was a collection of petty, jealous, vindictive beings who treated mortal lives like pieces on a cosmic chessboard, moving them around for entertainment, destroying them out of spite, and creating suffering for the sheer pleasure of watching mortals squirm beneath their divine heel. Zeus, the king of the gods, was perhaps the cruelest of all. His appetites were legendary, his jealousy boundless, and his punishments swift and merciless. When he desired a mortal woman, he would take her, regardless of the consequences. When his wife Hera discovered these affairs, she would unleash her wrath not upon her unfaithful husband, but upon the innocent women and their children. This divine dysfunction would become the source of endless suffering for countless heroes. The concept of heroism in ancient Greece was itself a trap. To be a hero meant to be noticed by the gods, and to be noticed by the gods was to invite disaster. Heroes were born from divine blood, blessed with supernatural abilities, but these gifts came with a price that no mortal could ever truly afford. They were chosen not to be rewarded, but to be tested, tormented, and ultimately destroyed by the very forces that created them. The Greeks had a word for this cosmic cruelty: hubris. But it wasn't just about mortal pride overstepping bounds. The entire system was rigged against heroes from the moment of their birth. They were given impossible tasks, conflicting loyalties, and divine curses that would follow them to their graves and beyond. Their heroic deeds were not celebrations of human potential, but elaborate tortures designed to break their spirits before ending their lives. Let us begin with perhaps the most famous of all Greek heroes, Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules. His story begins before his birth, with Zeus's insatiable lust and Hera's boundless rage. Zeus desired Alcmene, a mortal princess, and disguised himself as her husband to seduce her. When Hera discovered this affair, she didn't punish her philandering husband. Instead, she turned her divine wrath upon the innocent child who would be born from this union. From the moment Heracles drew his first breath, Hera tried to kill him. She sent 2 massive serpents to strangle the infant in his cradle, but even as a baby, Heracles possessed superhuman strength and crushed the snakes with his bare hands. This should have been a moment of triumph, a sign of the great hero he would become. Instead, it was merely the first act in a lifelong tragedy orchestrated by a jealous goddess. As Heracles grew to manhood, his strength became legendary. He could kill lions with his bare hands, move boulders that hundreds of men couldn't budge, and defeat entire armies single-handedly. But what good is physical strength against divine manipulation? Hera's cruelty had only just begun. The goddess struck Heracles with a fit of divine madness, a supernatural rage that consumed his mind and turned him into a monster. In this state of madness, he committed the most horrific act imaginable. He murdered his own wife, Megara, and their 3 children. When the madness lifted and Heracles realized what he had done, his anguish was so profound that it shook the very foundations of the earth. This was Hera's masterpiece of cruelty. She had turned the strongest man in the world into a child killer, forcing him to live with the knowledge that his own hands had destroyed everything he loved most. The guilt and horror of this act would haunt Heracles for the rest of his life, driving him to seek redemption through the most dangerous and impossible tasks imaginable. The oracle at Delphi told Heracles that to atone for his crime, he must serve his cousin Eurystheus, a weak and cowardly king who had been placed on the throne through Hera's manipulation. Eurystheus, knowing that he was doing the goddess's bidding, devised 12 labors so dangerous and impossible that no mortal could be expected to survive them. These weren't just tests of strength. They were elaborate death sentences designed to destroy Heracles slowly and painfully. The first labor was to kill the Nemean lion, a creature with a hide so tough that no weapon could penetrate it. Heracles strangled the beast with his bare hands, but the victory came at a cost. Every labor would chip away at his humanity, turning him from a man into a killing machine driven by guilt and divine manipulation. The second labor required him to kill the Hydra, a serpentine monster that grew 2 heads for every one that was cut off. Heracles enlisted the help of his nephew Iolaus, who cauterized the neck stumps to prevent new heads from growing. But Eurystheus declared this labor invalid because Heracles had received help, adding insult to injury and extending his torment. Each subsequent labor became more nightmarish than the last. He had to capture the Cyrenian hind, a sacred deer of Artemis, risking the wrath of yet another goddess. He had to clean the Augean stables in a single day, a task so degrading that it reduced the greatest hero in Greece to a common laborer, mucking out cattle dung. He had to steal the cattle of Geryon, a 3-bodied giant, traveling to the very edge of the known world and facing monsters that haunted the nightmares of lesser men. The psychological toll of these labors was immense. With each victory, Heracles became more isolated from humanity. His tremendous strength made normal human relationships impossible. Who could befriend a man who might accidentally crush your hand in greeting? Who could love someone whose touch could be deadly? Heracles was trapped in a body that made him more monster than man, performing acts of heroism that only deepened his isolation and despair. The 11th labor sent him to steal the golden apples of the Hesperides, a task that required him to hold up the heavens while Atlas retrieved the apples. For a brief moment, Heracles literally carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, a perfect metaphor for the burden he had borne his entire life. When Atlas tried to trick him into holding the heavens forever, Heracles had to use cunning to escape, proving that even his greatest acts of service were met with betrayal and deception. The final labor was the most telling of all. He had to descend into the underworld and capture Cerberus, the 3-headed guard dog of Hades. This task required Heracles to literally visit hell, to walk among the dead and face the lord of the underworld himself. Hades agreed to let Heracles take Cerberus, but only if he could subdue the beast without weapons. So the strongest man in the world wrestled with death itself, and won. But what kind of victory was this? Heracles had completed 12 impossible tasks, faced death and emerged victorious, proven himself the greatest hero who ever lived. And for what? The blood of his family still stained his hands. The guilt still consumed his soul. No amount of heroic deeds could wash away the horror of what Hera had forced him to do. Even after completing the labors, Heracles' suffering continued. He married Deianira, and for a brief moment it seemed he might find happiness. But happiness was not in the cards for a man cursed by the gods. When the centaur Nessus tried to assault Deianira, Heracles killed him with an arrow dipped in the hydrous poison. As he died, Nessus gave Deianira what he claimed was a love potion, but was actually the very poison that would destroy her husband. Years later, when Deianira suspected Heracles of infidelity, she sent him a robe soaked in this love potion. The moment Heracles put on the robe, the hydrous poison began to burn his flesh, but the fabric was fused to his skin and could not be removed. The strongest man in the world, who had defeated every monster and completed every impossible task, was brought low by a simple piece of clothing. The pain was so excruciating that Heracles begged for death, but even death would not come easily. The poison burned his flesh, but would not kill him quickly. In agony beyond description, he built his own funeral pyre and threw himself upon it, choosing to burn alive rather than endure the torment any longer. Even in death, the gods were not finished with him. Zeus, the father who had never acknowledged him properly in life, finally claimed Heracles and brought him to Olympus as a god. But this was not a reward. It was the final cruel joke. Heracles was forced to spend eternity in the presence of Hera, the goddess who had tormented him his entire life. His suffering had not ended with death. It had simply changed form. The tragedy of Heracles was not that he failed as a hero, but that he succeeded too well. His strength made him a target for divine jealousy. His heroic deeds only brought him more suffering. His victories were meaningless because the game was rigged from the start. He was the strongest man who ever lived, but he couldn't save his family, couldn't save himself, and couldn't escape the cycle of violence and suffering that the gods had trapped him in. If Heracles represents the hero crushed by divine manipulation, then Achilles represents the hero destroyed by the very nature of heroism itself. Born to the Synymbh Thetis and the mortal king Peleus, Achilles was blessed with gifts that would make him the greatest warrior who ever lived. But these gifts came with a prophecy that would haunt his entire short life. He could choose between a long, peaceful existence in obscurity or a brief life filled with glory that would end in death. At Troy, the choice itself was a trap, a false dilemma created by the fates to ensure Achilles' destruction. What young man, raised on stories of heroic glory and divine favor, would choose obscurity over immortal fame? The gods knew exactly what choice Achilles would make, and they constructed his fate accordingly. Thetis, knowing her son's destiny, tried desperately to save him. She dipped the infant Achilles in the river Styx, making him invulnerable to weapons everywhere except the heel by which she held him. This desperate act of maternal love would become the instrument of his doom. The gods had ensured that even a mother's perfect protection would contain the seeds of her child's destruction. When the call came for heroes to join the expedition against Troy, Thetis hid Achilles among the women of King Lycomed's court, disguising him as a girl to keep him from the war. But Odysseus, that master of cunning, discovered the ruse by placing weapons among women's trinkets and watching to see who would instinctively reach for the sword. Even a mother's love could not protect Achilles from his fate. At Troy, Achilles became a killing machine, unlike anything the world had ever seen. His rage in battle was supernatural, his skill with spear and sword unmatched by any mortal warrior. He could clear entire sections of the battlefield single-handedly, leaving rivers of blood in his wake. The Trojans whispered his name in terror, and even the gods themselves watched his battles with a mixture of awe and fear. But what was the cost of this martial perfection? Achilles was consumed by his own rage, transformed from a man into an instrument of divine wrath. He felt no joy in victory, no satisfaction in conquest. Each kill only fed the fire of his anger, making him more monstrous and less human. The very gifts that made him invincible in battle isolated him from every human emotion except fury. The breaking point came with the death of Patroclus, his beloved companion, and perhaps the only person who could still reach the man buried beneath. The warrior's rage. When Hector killed Patroclus in battle, Achilles' grief was so profound that it literally shook the earth. But this grief immediately transformed into a rage so terrible that it terrified even the gods. Thetis, seeing her son's anguish, commissioned the god Hephaestus to forge new armor for Achilles, including a shield that depicted the entire world in intricate detail. This shield was a masterpiece of divine craftsmanship, showing scenes of peace and war, love and death, the full spectrum of human experience. It was a cruel irony that Achilles, who had chosen war over peace, glory over love, death over life, would carry into battle a shield that showed him everything he had sacrificed for his moment of fame. When Achilles finally faced Hector in single combat, the outcome was never in doubt. The greatest warrior who ever lived against a brave but mortal prince could have only one ending. But Achilles' victory was tainted by the inhuman cruelty of his revenge. He dragged Hector's body behind his chariot around the walls of Troy, desecrating the corpse and horrifying even his own allies with the depths of his brutality. This act of savage revenge marked the moment when Achilles ceased to be a hero and became something else entirely, a force of pure destruction that even the gods found disturbing. When Priam, Hector's father, came to beg for his son's body, Achilles finally experienced a moment of human recognition. Seeing the old king's grief, he remembered his own father and the pain his death would cause. For a brief instant, the man emerged from beneath the monster, but it was too late for redemption. The prophecy had to be fulfilled, and fate would not be denied. Paris, guided by the god Apollo, shot an arrow that found the one vulnerable spot on Achilles' body, his heel. The greatest warrior who ever lived was brought down by a coward's shot, fired by a prince who had never won a battle, guided by a god who had grown tired of Achilles' defiance. The irony was perfect and cruel. Achilles had chosen glory over life, had become the most feared warrior in the world, had achieved the immortal fame that he desired. But what good was immortal fame to a dead man? His name would be remembered forever, but he would not be there to enjoy it. He had traded everything real and meaningful for a reputation that would outlive him. Even in death, the gods were not finished torturing Achilles. His shade in the underworld was condemned to eternal regret, forever knowing that he had chosen wrongly. When Odysseus visited him in Hades, Achilles spoke the most tragic words ever uttered by a hero. "I would rather be a living slave to a poor master than king of all the dead." The man who had chosen glory over life had learned too late that no amount of fame was worth a single day of actual existence. The tragedy of Achilles was not that he died young, but that he never really lived at all. From birth, he was shaped and molded to be a weapon, a tool of divine will and human ambition. His choices were illusions, his victories meaningless, his glory purchased with the coin of his own humanity. He achieved everything a hero was supposed to achieve, and it destroyed him completely. His story became a warning that the Greeks largely ignored, preferring the sanitized version that emphasized his glory rather than his suffering. But the truth remains. Achilles was not a hero triumphant, but a man destroyed by the very concept of heroism itself. His short, brilliant, terrible life was proof that the gods' greatest gift to mortals was also their cruelest curse. While Achilles chose the short path to glory and death, Odysseus represents a different kind of heroic tragedy, the slow-burning torment of a man whose cleverness became his curse. Known as the master of cunning, the man of many tricks, Odysseus seemed blessed with the one quality that might actually help a hero survive in a world ruled by capricious gods: intelligence. But the gods, it turned out, had special punishments, reserved for mortals who dared to rely on their wits rather than blind faith. Odysseus's troubles began, not with a divine curse or prophecy, but with his own cleverness. When the Greek armies gathered at Aulis to sail for Troy, Odysseus tried to avoid the war by feigning madness, ploughing his fields with salt and sowing them with stones. He had correctly intuited that this war would bring nothing but suffering to all involved, but the Greeks saw through his ruse, and his attempt to escape his fate only ensured that the gods would take special interest in his punishment at Troy. Odysseus's cunning proved invaluable to the Greek cause. He was the mastermind behind the Trojan horse, the brilliant stratagem that finally ended the 10-year siege. He saved countless Greek lives through his intelligence and strategic thinking. He should have been rewarded as the hero who ended the war. Instead, his very success marked him for divine retribution. The gods, you see, had grown tired of Odysseus's cleverness. They had watched him outsmart enemies, escape from impossible situations, and solve problems through wit rather than strength or divine intervention. His intelligence made him too independent, too self-reliant, too human. The gods preferred heroes who depended on divine favor, who could be controlled and manipulated. Odysseus's mind made him dangerous to the cosmic order. Poseidon, god of the sea, took particular offense when Odysseus blinded his son, the Cyclops, Polyphemus. But Odysseus's real crime wasn't the blinding itself. It was his inability to resist, revealing his true name to the defeated monster. His pride in his own cleverness, his need to claim credit for his victory, gave Poseidon the opening he needed to curse the hero with a decade of wandering and suffering. What followed was not an adventure, as it's often portrayed, but a systematic destruction of everything Odysseus held dear. Each stop on his journey home was another trap, another test designed to strip away another piece of his humanity. The gods didn't want to kill Odysseus quickly. They wanted to break him slowly, to teach him that no mortal, no matter how clever, could outsmart divine will. On the island of the Lotus Eaters, Odysseus lost several crew members to a drug that made them forget their homeland entirely. These men, his companions and friends, chose oblivion over the pain of longing for home. It was a preview of the choice Odysseus himself would face repeatedly: surrender his identity and find peace, or cling to his memories and endure endless suffering. The encounter with Polyphemus cost him more men and earned him Poseidon's eternal enmity. But it also revealed the cruel logic of heroic thinking. Odysseus could have escaped anonymously, but his pride demanded that he claim credit for his victory. This moment of human vanity condemned him to years of suffering and condemned his remaining crew to death. Atia, the witch, Circe, turned his men into pigs, a transformation that was perhaps more honest than cruel. Under the pressures of their endless voyage, many of Odysseus's companions had already become less than human, reduced to basic survival instincts and animal fears. Circe's magic simply made visible what the journey had already done to their souls. Even when Circe became his ally and lover, the relationship was poisoned by divine manipulation. She advised him to visit the underworld, to seek prophecy from the shade of the blind seer, Tiresias. This journey to the realm of the dead was perhaps the cruelest torture yet devised by the gods. Odysseus was forced to see what death had done to his former companions, to witness the meaningless existence that awaited all mortals, to confront the ultimate futility of all human endeavor. In Hades, Odysseus encountered the shade of Achilles, who delivered those devastating words about preferring to be a living slave than king of the dead. But Odysseus also met his own mother, Anticlea, who had died of grief waiting for his return. Here was the true cost of his heroic journey. While he wandered the seas fighting monsters and gods, the people who loved him were dying of sorrow. At home, the encounter with the sirens was perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated torture the gods had yet devised. These creatures didn't threaten Odysseus with death or transformation. They offered him knowledge. They sang of all the things that had happened at Troy, all the secrets of gods and men, all the hidden truths of the universe. For a man whose greatest strength was his intelligence, this was the ultimate temptation. Odysseus resisted by having his men bind him to the mast and stop their ears with wax. But the cost was enormous. He heard the siren's song, learnt their secrets, but could never act on that knowledge. He became a man tormented by truths he couldn't use, by wisdom that only increased his suffering. The gods had found a way to turn his greatest gift, his love of knowledge, into an instrument of torture. The passage between Scylla and Charybdis forced Odysseus to make an impossible choice: lose 6 men to the 6-headed monster, or lose his entire ship to the whirlpool. He chose to sacrifice 6 of his companions, a decision that was tactically sound but morally devastating. Each choice the gods forced him to make stripped away another piece of his humanity, until the man who returned to Ithaca bore little resemblance. To the hero who had left for Troy, the final insult came when his starving crew slaughtered the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios. Odysseus had warned them against this act, but hunger and despair had driven them beyond reason. Zeus destroyed the ship with a thunderbolt, killing all of Odysseus's remaining companions and leaving him alone on the vast sea. After 20 years of leadership, 20 years of trying to bring his men home, Odysseus failed completely. Every single one of his companions died, and he reached Ithaca utterly alone. But even his homecoming was poisoned by the gods' cruelty. During his 20-year absence, suitors had invaded his palace, consuming his wealth and terrorizing his wife Penelope. His son Telemachus had grown up without a father, shaped by absence and uncertainty. Odysseus returned not to triumph, but to find his life in ruins and his family traumatized by his heroic journey. The massacre of the suitors, often portrayed as righteous vengeance, was actually the final act in Odysseus's transformation from hero to monster. He killed over 100 men in his own hall, turning his home into a slaughterhouse. The man of many tricks had become a man of many murders, solving his problems through violence rather than the cleverness that had once defined him. Even after reclaiming his throne and reuniting with his family, Odysseus found no peace. The families of the dead suitors sought revenge, threatening to plunge Ithaca into civil war. The gods, who had tormented him for 20 years, now demanded that he leave home again to make sacrifices and seek absolution. His suffering would continue until the day he died, and perhaps beyond. The true tragedy of Odysseus was not that his journey home took 20 years, but that the man who finally arrived in Ithaca was not the same man who had left. The gods had systematically destroyed everything that made him human: his loyalty to his companions, his trust in divine justice, his hope for a peaceful life. He had won his battle against the gods, but the victory was meaningless because he had lost himself in the process. Odysseus' story reveals the ultimate futility of heroic intelligence in a world ruled by divine caprice. No amount of cleverness could protect him from the gods' malice. No strategic thinking could save his companions. No cunning could preserve his family from suffering. His mind, his greatest gift, became the instrument of his own destruction. As the gods used his very intelligence to design ever more sophisticated tortures, the man of many tricks became the man of many sorrows. And his homecoming was not a triumph, but a tragedy disguised as a happy ending. The story of Jason and Medea represents perhaps the most psychologically complex tragedy in all of Greek mythology. A tale where heroic ambition, divine manipulation, and human passion combine to create a perfect storm of destruction. It begins with a quest for glory and ends with infanticide, showing how the pursuit of heroic fame can corrupt every human bond and transform love itself into an instrument of revenge. Jason's troubles began before his birth, rooted in the dynastic struggles that plagued every heroic bloodline. His uncle Peleus had usurped the throne of Iolcus from Jason's father, and when Jason came of age to reclaim his birthright, Peleus devised what he thought was a perfect solution: send the young man on an impossible quest that would result in his death. The golden fleece, hanging in a sacred grove in fair-off Colchis, guarded by a sleepless dragon and protected by King Aeetes, seemed like an appropriately heroic death sentence. But Peleus had underestimated the gods' love of irony. They would indeed use this quest to destroy Jason, but not in the way his uncle expected. Instead of killing him quickly and cleanly, they would give him everything he thought he wanted, and then reveal the true cost of heroic ambition. Jason gathered the greatest heroes of his generation for the quest: the Argonauts, a collection of demigods, princes, and warriors whose very names rang with legendary power: Heracles the mighty, Orpheus the poet, Castor and Pollux, the divine twins, Theseus the king of Athens. It should have been the greatest heroic expedition ever assembled, a fellowship of legends united in glorious purpose. Instead, it became a study in how heroic egos inevitably destroy any hope of genuine cooperation. The Argonauts spent as much time fighting each other as they did confronting external enemies. Heracles abandoned the quest to search for his lost lover Hylas. The others quarreled over leadership, honor, and the division of spoils that didn't yet exist. Jason, who was supposed to be their leader, found himself constantly mediating between massive egos while struggling to maintain any semblance of authority. When they finally reached Colchis, Jason discovered that King Aeetes had no intention of simply handing over the golden fleece. Instead, he set Jason 3 impossible tasks: yoke fire-breathing bronze bulls, plow a field and sow it with dragon's teeth, and then defeat the armed warriors who would spring from the earth. These tasks were designed to kill Jason in the most spectacular way possible, providing entertainment for the gods and a cautionary tale for future heroes. But the gods had their own plans for Jason's destruction, and those plans required him to survive long enough to experience true suffering. They had Aphrodite's son Eros shoot Medea, Eetis' daughter, and a powerful sorceress with an arrow of irresistible love. This divine intervention doomed both Jason and Medea, though neither realized it at the time. Medea's love was not the gentle affection of mortal romance, but a supernatural obsession created by divine magic. She betrayed her father, her country, and her own nature to help Jason complete his impossible tasks. She used her magic to protect him from the fire-breathing bulls, to help him defeat the Earthborn warriors, and finally to drug the sleepless dragon so he could steal the golden fleece. But each act of magical assistance came at a terrible cost to Medea's soul. She was transforming herself from a princess and priestess into a traitor and a criminal, all for a man who saw her primarily as a useful tool for achieving his goals. Jason accepted her help gladly, but never truly understood the magnitude of her sacrifice or the depth of her supernatural love. The return journey revealed the true horror of what Medea had become. When her father's ships pursued the Argo, Medea committed an act so monstrous that it haunted her for the rest of her life. She murdered her own brother, Absiritus, and scattered pieces of his body on the sea, knowing that her father would have to stop to collect the remains for proper burial. This act of fratricide bought Jason and the Argonauts their escape, but it marked the moment when Medea crossed a line from which there could be no return. Jason, rather than being horrified by this act, was grateful for it. He had allowed his ambition to blind him to the moral cost of his quest. The Golden Fleece, symbol of heroic achievement, had been purchased with the blood of innocence, and Jason was content to pay that price as long as someone else's hands did the actual killing. When they returned to Iolcus, Jason discovered that Peleus had killed his father and forced his mother to commit suicide. The quest that was supposed to restore Jason to his rightful throne had resulted in the destruction of his family. But Medea, ever helpful, offered a solution. She convinced Peleus's daughters that she could restore their father's youth through a magical ritual, then tricked them into killing him and boiling his body in a cauldron. This act of revenge satisfied Jason's desire for justice, but it also made him complicit in yet another murder. The people of Iolcos, horrified by this crime, drove Jason and Medea into exile. They found refuge in Corinth, where for a time it seemed they might find peace. They married, had children, and Jason seemed content to live as the husband of a powerful sorceress rather than pursuing further heroic adventures. But this domestic tranquility was itself a trap set by the gods, who were not finished with their punishment of these two tragic figures. After 10 years of marriage, Jason made the decision that would trigger the final catastrophe. He chose to divorce Medea and marry Glos, the daughter of King Creon of Corinth. This decision was presented as political necessity, a way to secure his position and provide for his children's future. But it was also the ultimate betrayal of the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. Jason's justification for this betrayal revealed the true shallowness of his character. He argued that Medea should be grateful for the divorce, as it would allow her to return to a more normal life while he secured their children's future through his new marriage. He failed completely to understand that Medea's love was not a mortal emotion that could be reasoned with or dismissed, but a divine curse that had consumed her entire identity. Medea's response was swift and terrible. She sent Glos a wedding dress and crowns soaked in poison, gifts that burned the princess alive when she put them on. Creon, trying to save his daughter, was also consumed by the magical fire. Jason arrived at the palace to find his new bride and her father dying in agony, their flesh melting from their bones. But Medea was not finished. In her supernatural rage, she committed the most horrific act imaginable. She murdered her own children, the sons she had borne to Jason. This was not a crime of passion, but a calculated act of revenge, designed to destroy Jason's future and leave him with nothing but grief and guilt. She killed the children, not despite her love for them, but because she loved them, knowing that their deaths would cause Jason the maximum possible suffering. When Jason confronted her over the bodies of their children, Medea revealed the full depth of her transformation. She had become something inhuman, a creature of pure vengeance who had murdered her own offspring to spite their father. She escaped in a chariot drawn by dragons, sent by her grandfather, the sun god, leaving Jason alone with the consequences of his ambition. The tragedy of Jason and Medea was not just personal, but cosmic. Jason's quest for heroic glory had corrupted everyone it touched. Medea's supernatural love had transformed her into a monster. Their children had paid the ultimate price for their parents' crimes. The golden fleece, symbol of heroic achievement, had become a curse that destroyed everyone who pursued it. Jason lived the rest of his life in exile and disgrace, haunted by the knowledge that his ambition had led directly to the deaths of his children. He died alone and forgotten when a piece of the rotting Argo fell on him, crushed by the debris of his former glory. The hero who had sought immortal fame through his quest found only infamy and regret. The story of Jason and Medea reveals how heroic ambition inevitably corrupts human relationships, turning love into possession, loyalty into exploitation, and family into collateral damage. The gods' punishment was perfect in its symmetry. They gave Jason exactly what he thought he wanted, then showed him the true cost of getting it. Theseus presents perhaps the most complex case study in heroic tragedy. A man who achieved everything a Greek hero was supposed to achieve, only to watch it all crumble in his hands through a combination of divine malice, personal flaws, and the inevitable corruption that comes with power. His story spans the full arc of heroic life: miraculous birth, impossible labors, kingship, and ultimately, disgrace and exile. Born to Aethra, Princess of Troezen, Theseus was the product of either divine intervention or royal indiscretion, depending on which version of his parentage you believe. Aegeus, king of Athens, or perhaps Poseidon himself, had fathered this child who would grow up to embody both the greatest potential and the most tragic limitations of heroic nature. Like so many heroes, Theseus's very conception was shrouded in mystery and marked him for a destiny beyond normal human experience. His youth seemed to promise greatness. Raised in secret to protect him from political enemies, Theseus proved his heroic nature by choosing the dangerous overland route to Athens rather than the safe sea voyage. Along the way, he defeated a series of bandits and monsters, each victory demonstrating his courage, strength, and commitment to justice. He killed Periphetes, the club-bearer, Cines, the pine-bender, the Crommyonian sow, and Siren, the kicker. Each of these victories seemed to prove that Theseus was different from other heroes, that he fought not for glory but for justice, not for personal gain but to make the world safer for ordinary people. But even these early victories contained the seeds of his later corruption. With each monster slain, each bandit defeated, Theseus grew more confident in his own righteousness, more certain that his violence was justified by its noble purpose. He began to see himself as a force of divine justice, a man set apart from ordinary morality by his heroic mission. This self-righteousness would eventually become his greatest weakness. When Theseus finally reached Athens, he discovered that his father's kingdom was being terrorized by an even more monstrous demand. Every 7 years, Athens was forced to send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete as tribute to King Minos, where they would be fed to the Minotaur, a creature half man and half bull that dwelt in an inescapable labyrinth. This tribute was both a political humiliation and a human sacrifice, a reminder of Athens' subordinate status and the price of past defeats. Theseus volunteered to be among the victims, planning to kill the Minotaur and end the tribute forever. This seemed like the perfect heroic quest, a clear monster to defeat, innocent lives to save, and a kingdom to liberate from foreign oppression. What could go wrong with such a noble mission? The answer, as always with Greek heroes, was everything. In Crete, Theseus caught the attention of Ariadne, daughter of King Minos, who fell in love with him and agreed to help him navigate the labyrinth. She gave him a ball of thread to mark his path and a sword to kill the Minotaur. With her help, Theseus penetrated to the heart of the labyrinth, defeated the monster, and led the Athenian victims to freedom. But Theseus's treatment of Ariadne revealed the first crack in his heroic facade. After she had betrayed her own father to save him, after she had given him the means to achieve his greatest victory, Theseus abandoned her on the island of Naxos while she slept. Different versions of the story offered different explanations for this betrayal, but the most common suggests that Theseus simply grew tired of her once her usefulness had ended. This abandonment of Ariadne was not just a personal betrayal, but a cosmic crime. She had saved not just Theseus, but all the young Athenians who would have died in the labyrinth. Her reward was to be cast away like refuse once the hero had what he needed. The gods took notice of this ingratitude, and their punishment would be swift and terrible. The first consequence of Theseus's betrayal came during his voyage home. In his excitement over his victory, he forgot to change his ship's black sails to white ones, the signal he had arranged with his father to indicate his success. King Aegeus, watching from a cliff and seeing the black sails of failure, threw himself into the sea in despair. Theseus's moment of greatest triumph was thus tainted by the suicide of his father, a death caused by his own carelessness and excitement. This tragedy transformed Theseus from a heroic prince into the king of Athens, but it was a crown purchased with his father's blood and his own guilt. The hero who had set out to save lives had returned to find that his victory had cost the life of the man he loved most. The gods had shown him that no heroic deed, no matter how noble, comes without a price. As king of Athens, Theseus initially seemed to justify the faith placed in him. He united the scattered tribes of Attica under Athenian rule, established laws and institutions, and made Athens into a major power in the Greek world. He participated in the war against the Amazons, defeating these warrior women and marrying their queen, Antiope. He joined the Argonauts in their quest for the Golden Fleece and helped Heracles in his labors. But power corrupted Theseus as it corrupts all heroes. His marriage to Antiope was based on conquest rather than love, and when she died in battle defending him against her own people, he felt more relief than grief. He had grown tired of her foreign ways, her warrior's independence, her refusal to be transformed into a conventional Greek wife. Her death freed him to marry Phaedra, Ariadne's sister, in a union that was both politically advantageous and personally satisfying. The marriage to Phaedra seemed to offer Theseus a chance for redemption. By marrying Ariadne's sister, he could symbolically atone for his earlier betrayal. Phaedra was beautiful, intelligent, and well-connected, the perfect queen for an ambitious king. But the gods had not forgotten Theseus's crime against Ariadne, and they used Phaedra herself as the instrument of their revenge. Aphrodite, offended by Hippolytus's devotion to the chaste goddess Artemis, cursed Phaedra with an overwhelming passion for her stepson. Hippolytus was Theseus's son by Antiope, a young man devoted to hunting and celibacy who wanted nothing to do with the complications of love or politics. He was everything his father had once been, young, idealistic, certain of his own righteousness. When Phaedra confessed her love to Hippolytus, he reacted with horror and disgust, threatening to tell Theseus of her shameful passion. Phaedra, driven to desperation by his rejection and threat, hanged herself, but left behind a letter accusing Hippolytus of rape. This lie was her final act of revenge against the family that had destroyed her sister and now destroyed her Theseus. Finding his wife dead and reading her accusation, flew into a rage that blinded him to all reason and justice. Without investigation, without giving his son a chance to defend himself, he called upon his divine father Poseidon to punish the young man. The god sent a sea monster that frightened Hippolytus's horses, causing a crash that killed the innocent youth. Only after Hippolytus was dead did Artemis appear to reveal the truth to Theseus. His son had been innocent, faithful, and pure. His wife had been the victim of divine manipulation, driven to madness by Aphrodite's curse, and Theseus himself had been the unwitting instrument of cosmic revenge, used by the gods to destroy his own family as punishment for his treatment of Ariadne. The revelation of his son's innocence and his own guilt shattered Theseus completely. The man who had once been so certain of his righteousness, so confident in his ability to distinguish between justice and injustice, had murdered his own innocent child. All his heroic deeds, all his service to Athens, all his attempts to be a just king could not undo this one terrible act. But the gods were not finished with Theseus. As he aged, his grip on power weakened, and his subjects began to remember his failures rather than his successes. They recalled his abandonment of Ariadne, his marriage of convenience to Phaedra, his hasty judgment of Hippolytus, became increasingly isolated, surrounded by courtiers who feared rather than loved him in his final years. Theseus made one last attempt to recapture his lost heroic glory. He joined his friend Pirithous in an insane plan to kidnap Persephone, queen of the underworld, so that Pirithous could marry her. This mission was doomed from the start, a product of the same arrogance and self-righteousness that had characterized Theseus's entire career in the underworld. Hades captured both heroes and bound them to chairs of forgetfulness, where they were tortured for years. Heracles eventually rescued Theseus during one of his own labors, but Pirithous remained trapped forever. Theseus returned to Athens, broken in body and spirit, only to discover that his people had lost all faith in him. During his absence, the final insult came when the Athenians, led by Menisteus, drove Theseus into exile. The man who had united Attica, who had made Athens a great power, who had devoted his life to serving his city, was rejected by the very people he had tried to protect. He fled to the island of Cyrus, where King Lycomedes, either out of treachery or fear, pushed him off a cliff to his death. Theseus died alone and forgotten, his body broken on the rocks below, his heroic legacy reduced to cautionary tales and political propaganda. The man who had killed the Minotaur, who had been the greatest king Athens ever knew, died as an exile and a failure, rejected by gods and mortals alike. The tragedy of Theseus was not that he failed to achieve heroic greatness, but that he achieved it and then lost it through his own flaws. His righteousness became self-righteousness. His justice became vengeance. His heroism became tyranny. The gods had given him everything he thought he wanted, then systematically stripped it all away, showing him that heroic virtue without wisdom and humility inevitably transforms into its opposite. Theseus' story reveals the ultimate futility of the heroic ideal. No matter how noble the intentions, no matter how great the achievements, the combination of divine malice and human weakness inevitably corrupts even the best of heroes. The man who set out to make the world safer and more just ended up destroying his own family and dying in disgrace, proof that the gods' greatest gift to mortals is also their cruelest joke. To understand the true horror of being a Greek hero, we must examine the role of the gods not as distant observers or occasional helpers, but as the primary architects of heroic misery. The Olympian pantheon was not a collection of benevolent deities guiding humanity toward enlightenment and virtue. They were cosmic sadists, bored immortals who treated mortal lives as entertainment, creating heroes specifically to watch them suffer and fall. The gods' cruelty was not random or chaotic. It was systematic and purposeful. They understood human psychology better than humans understood themselves, and they used this knowledge to design punishments that were perfectly calibrated to cause maximum suffering. They didn't simply kill heroes. They corrupted them, turned their virtues into vices, their strengths into weaknesses, their loves into instruments of destruction. Consider the divine logic behind heroic creation. The gods would seduce or rape mortal women, creating children with supernatural abilities and divine blood. These children were automatically marked for tragedy, born into a world where they were too powerful to live normal human lives, but too mortal to challenge divine authority. They were given just enough power to believe they could control their destinies, then subjected to tests and trials designed to prove their ultimate helplessness. Zeus, the king of the gods, was perhaps the most sophisticated torturer of heroes. His method was to create impossible situations where heroes had to choose between equally devastating alternatives. He would place them in scenarios where every choice led to tragedy, where moral action guaranteed immoral consequences, where the attempt to do good inevitably produced evil results. Take Heracles, Zeus's own son. The king of the gods could have protected his child from Hera's jealousy, could have intervened to prevent the madness that led to the murder of Heracles' family. Instead, Zeus allowed his wife to torment his son, watching with apparent amusement as the strongest man in the world was driven to infanticide, and then forced to perform degrading labors as penance. But Zeus's cruelty went deeper than simple neglect. He designed Heracles' entire life as a cosmic joke about the nature of strength and power. The stronger Heracles became, the more isolated he grew from normal human contact. His physical power made genuine relationships impossible, turning him into a monster who could only relate to the world through violence. Zeus gave his son infinite strength and no way to use it that wouldn't cause more harm than good. Hera, Zeus's wife, specialized in a different kind of divine cruelty, the corruption of family bonds. She understood that heroes, despite their supernatural abilities, were still fundamentally human in their need for love and connection. So she systematically destroyed these connections, turning parents against children, wives against husbands, siblings against each other. Hera's persecution of Heracles was just one example of her preferred method of torture. She would target the innocent family members of heroes, knowing that their suffering would cause the heroes more pain than any direct attack. She understood the heroes could endure physical agony and supernatural trials, but they could not bear the knowledge that their loved ones were suffering because of their heroic status. Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, preferred more intellectual forms of torture. She would give heroes just enough knowledge to understand the full horror of their situations without providing them the power to change their fates. She was the patron of Odysseus, but her protection consisted mainly of ensuring that he remained conscious and aware throughout 20 years of suffering. Her gift of wisdom became a curse, forcing him to understand exactly how hopeless his situation was while being unable to escape it. Aphrodite, goddess of love, turned the most fundamental human emotion into a weapon of mass destruction. She didn't inspire gentle, nurturing love. She created obsessions, passions, so overwhelming that they destroyed the capacity for rational thought or moral action. Her gift of love to Medea was actually a death sentence, a supernatural compulsion that transformed a princess and priestess into a child-murdering monster. The most insidious aspect of divine torture was how it corrupted the very concept of heroism itself. The gods didn't oppose heroes. They created them, shaped them, and directed them toward their destruction. They made heroism seem noble and necessary, while ensuring that every heroic act carried within it the seeds of tragedy. The gods were particularly cruel in how they used prophecy and fate as instruments of torture. They would reveal to heroes exactly what terrible fate awaited them, then make that fate inevitable through the hero's own attempts to avoid it. Oedipus fled Corinth to avoid killing his father and marrying his mother, but this flight led him directly to Thebes, where he unknowingly fulfilled the prophecy by killing Laius and marrying Jocasta. This divine manipulation of fate reveals the true sophistication of the gods' cruelty. They didn't simply impose arbitrary punishments. They engineered situations where heroes would destroy themselves through their own choices and actions. The gods made heroes complicit in their own destruction, forcing them to carry not just the burden of suffering, but the guilt of having caused that suffering through their own decisions. The concept of divine justice was perhaps the cruelest joke of all. The gods claimed to punish heroes for hubris, for excessive pride or defiance of divine will. But the truth was that heroes were punished for being heroic, for possessing the very qualities that the gods had given them. Achilles was punished for his rage, but that rage was a divine gift. Odysseus was punished for his cleverness, but that cleverness came from Athena herself. The gods created heroes with specific traits and abilities, then punished them for using those traits. It was like giving a child a toy and then beating the child for playing with it. The punishment wasn't about maintaining cosmic order or teaching moral lessons. It was about demonstrating divine power and providing entertainment for bored immortals. The isolation of heroes was another form of systematic torture. The gods ensured that heroes could never find true companionship or understanding among mortals. Their supernatural abilities and divine heritage set them apart from normal humans, while their mortality prevented them from forming genuine relationships with gods. They were trapped between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. This isolation was particularly cruel because it prevented heroes from learning from each other's experiences. Each hero had to face his trials alone, without the benefit of advice or support from others who had endured similar suffering. The gods made sure the heroic knowledge died with each hero, ensuring that future generations would repeat the same mistakes and suffer the same torments. The gods also used the concept of honor and glory as a trap. They made heroes crave immortal fame, then showed them that such fame was purchased with the coin of human suffering. Heroes were encouraged to pursue glory through violence, conquest, and the completion of impossible tasks. But each victory brought them further away from human happiness and closer to divine punishment. The ultimate cruelty was that the gods made heroism seem meaningful and necessary while ensuring that it was actually futile and destructive. Heroes genuinely believed they were making the world better, protecting the innocent, serving justice, but their heroic actions inevitably caused more harm than good, creating cycles of violence and revenge that would continue for generations. The gods had created a perfect system for producing and consuming human suffering. They generated heroes as farmers grow crops, carefully tending and shaping them until they were ready for harvest. And the harvest was always the same: broken spirits, destroyed families, and cautionary tales that would inspire the next generation of heroes to repeat the same tragic patterns. Beyond the physical trials and divine torments lay a deeper horror that pervaded every aspect of heroic life: the complete destruction of normal human psychology. Heroes were not simply people with extraordinary abilities. They were fundamentally broken individuals, traumatized from birth by their supernatural nature and systematically dehumanized by their experiences. To be a hero was to forfeit any claim to mental health, emotional stability, or psychological wholeness. Consider the developmental trauma of heroic childhood. From their earliest years, heroes knew they were different, that they possessed abilities that set them apart from other children. But this difference was not a blessing. It was a curse that prevented them from forming normal attachments or developing healthy relationships. How do you make friends with children when your strength might accidentally kill them? How do you play games when your supernatural abilities give you an unfair advantage in everything? Heracles' childhood illustrates this perfectly. While other babies were learning to crawl and speak, he was strangling divine serpents sent to kill him. This early exposure to lethal violence shaped his understanding of the world in profoundly disturbing ways. For Heracles, the normal state of existence was mortal danger, and the appropriate response to any problem was overwhelming force. He never learned the social skills of negotiation, compromise, or peaceful conflict resolution because violence had always been his first and most effective option. The isolation of heroic childhood created what we might recognize today as severe attachment disorders. Heroes grew up unable to form genuine emotional bonds with other people, viewing relationships primarily in terms of utility and survival. They learned to see other humans as potential threats, useful allies, or helpless victims to be protected, but never as equals, deserving of empathy and understanding. This emotional stunting was compounded by the constant awareness of their own mortality, despite their supernatural abilities. Heroes lived with the knowledge that they were stronger, faster, and more skilled than ordinary humans, but also that they were ultimately doomed to suffer and die in ways that would make their superiority meaningless. This created a profound existential anxiety, a constant tension between their sense of power and their awareness of powerlessness. The psychological impact of divine manipulation was perhaps even more devastating than the physical trials heroes endured. Imagine living with the knowledge that cosmic forces were actively working to destroy you, that every choice you made might be part of an elaborate divine trap, that your own thoughts and emotions might be influenced by gods who viewed your suffering. As entertainment. Heroes developed what we might call paranoid hypervigilance, a constant state of mental alertness that prevented them from ever truly relaxing or finding peace. They had to assume that every stranger might be a god in disguise, Every opportunity might be a trap. Every moment of happiness might be a setup for future tragedy. This chronic stress would have been psychologically devastating even without the actual supernatural threats they faced. The moral complexity of heroic actions created another layer of psychological torture. Heroes were forced to make decisions that violated their own moral principles in service of some greater good. But these compromises accumulated over time, eroding their sense of self and their ability to distinguish between right and wrong. Odysseus's journey home required him to lie, cheat, steal, and manipulate countless innocent people. Each of these actions was justifiable in terms of his ultimate goal, but collectively they transformed him from a principled leader into a ruthless survivor. This moral erosion was particularly cruel because heroes typically began their careers with strong ethical foundations and genuine desires to help others. They became monsters not through choice but through the inexorable logic of their circumstances. The gods had designed a world where moral action was impossible, where every choice led to compromise, and where the attempt to remain pure inevitably resulted in greater harm. The phenomenon of heroic rage represents another aspect of the psychological horror of heroic existence. Heroes were subject to fits of supernatural anger that temporarily transformed them into mindless killing machines. These episodes were not simple emotional outbursts, but complete dissociative breaks from reality. Periods where the hero's consciousness was completely overwhelmed by divine wrath. Achilles' rage at the death of Patroclus was so intense that it literally changed his physical appearance, making his eyes glow with supernatural fire and his voice echo like a war trumpet. During this rage, he was no longer human in any meaningful sense. He had become an instrument of divine vengeance, capable of slaughtering dozens of enemies without experiencing any normal human emotions like fear, pity, or exhaustion. But the truly horrifying aspect of heroic rage was what happened when it ended. Heroes would return to consciousness to find themselves covered in blood, surrounded by corpses, with only fragmented memories of what they had done. They had to live with the knowledge that they were capable of becoming monsters, that their own bodies and minds could be hijacked by forces beyond their control and used to commit acts of incredible violence. The survivor's guilt experienced by heroes was overwhelming and persistent. Every hero watched friends and companions die while they themselves survived, often because their supernatural abilities allowed them to escape dangers that killed ordinary mortals. This created a profound sense of responsibility and guilt that poisoned any satisfaction they might have felt in their own survival. Odysseus returned to Ithaca having lost every single member of his crew. 600 men who had followed him to Troy and died during the long journey home. Each death was a personal failure in his mind, a reminder that his leadership and cleverness had not been enough to save the men who trusted him. The knowledge that he alone had survived when so many others had perished created a psychological burden that no amount of heroic achievement could lift. The sexual psychology of heroes was deeply disturbed by their supernatural nature and traumatic experiences. Normal romantic relationships were impossible for beings whose touch might be lethal and whose lives were constantly threatened by divine intervention. Heroes either remained celibate, like Hippolytus, or engaged in relationships that were fundamentally unequal and ultimately destructive. When heroes did form romantic attachments, these relationships were inevitably poisoned by the power imbalances and supernatural dangers that surrounded heroic life. Their partners were either mortals who couldn't truly understand their experiences, or divine beings who viewed them as temporary diversions. Either way, genuine intimacy and emotional connection were impossible. The aging process for heroes was particularly cruel, because their supernatural abilities often remained strong even as their judgment and emotional stability deteriorated. Old heroes became increasingly isolated, bitter, and prone to making decisions that destroyed everything they had built over their lifetimes. Theseus, in his final years, exemplifies this pattern, becoming so detached from reality that he thought he could kidnap the queen of the underworld and face no consequences. Perhaps most horrifying of all was the complete absence of psychological healing or growth in heroic narratives. Heroes never learnt from their mistakes, never developed better coping strategies, never found ways to manage their trauma or build healthier relationships. They were trapped in cycles of violence and suffering that only ended with death, unable to break free from patterns that had been established in their earliest experiences. The gods had created heroes to be perfect psychological victims, beings whose very nature ensured that they would never find peace, happiness, or emotional fulfillment. Every aspect of heroic psychology was designed to maximize suffering while maintaining the capacity to continue functioning as tools of divine will. Heroes were not tragic figures who fell from greatness. They were traumatized individuals who had never been allowed to develop normal human psychology in the first place. The horror of Greek heroism extends far beyond the individual suffering of legendary figures. It created a template for human misery that is echoed through millennia, shaping how we understand courage, ambition, and the price of greatness. The myths we've examined tonight are not simply ancient stories, but blueprints for tragedy that continue to play out in every age, in every culture, wherever mortals dare to dream of transcending their limitations. The Greeks understood something profound and terrible about human nature, that our greatest strengths inevitably become our greatest weaknesses, that success plants the seeds of failure, and that the very qualities we most admire in heroes are the same qualities that guarantee their destruction. This pattern has repeated itself throughout history, from ancient kings to modern celebrities, from military leaders to revolutionary figures, all following the same tragic arc established by their mythological predecessors. Consider how the Heracles archetype manifests in our modern world, the strong man whose very strength isolates him from human connection, whose every victory in the public arena is matched by defeat in his personal life. We see this pattern in athletes who dominate their sports but destroy their families, in business leaders who build empires while losing their souls, in politicians whose quest for power corrupts everything they originally stood for. The mechanism is identical. Supernatural ability in one area of life that demands such sacrifice in all other areas that success becomes indistinguishable from tragedy. The Achilles pattern is equally recognizable. The young person blessed with extraordinary talent who must choose between a long, ordinary life and a brief, brilliant career that ends in destruction. This choice haunts every generation of artists, soldiers, and performers who must decide whether to burn brightly and die young, or preserve themselves for a longer but less significant existence. The modern cult of celebrity is essentially an Achilles cult, worshipping those who achieve immortal fame at the cost of their humanity and often their lives. Odysseus represents perhaps the most modern of all heroic archetypes, the clever person whose intelligence becomes a curse, who solves every problem but loses everything that matters in the process. In our technological age, we see this pattern everywhere. Brilliant innovators who revolutionize the world but destroy their personal relationships. Scientists whose discoveries advance human knowledge while consuming their own lives. entrepreneurs who build successful companies but lose their families and their health. In the process, the Jason and Medea dynamic plays out constantly in our contemporary world, wherever ambition meets love and destroys both. The ambitious person, who uses others to achieve their goals, then discards them when they become inconvenient, only to discover that their victim's revenge is more terrible than they ever imagined. Corporate scandals, political betrayals, and celebrity divorces often follow this exact pattern, with the same inevitable outcome of mutual destruction. Theseus's trajectory from heroic reformer to corrupt tyrant is perhaps the most politically relevant of all heroic patterns. History is littered with leaders who began as champions of justice and liberation, but gradually transformed into the very oppressors they had originally fought against. Revolutionary heroes become dictators, reformers become corrupt politicians, idealists become cynics who use their former principles as weapons against their enemies. But the most insidious legacy of Greek heroism is how it has shaped our understanding of what it means to be exceptional. The heroic ideal teaches us that greatness requires sacrifice, that achievement demands suffering, that true success can only be purchased with the coin of human misery. This belief system has justified countless personal and social tragedies, from the destruction of families in pursuit of career advancement to the sacrifice of entire generations in service of ideological goals. The heroic mindset teaches us to romanticize suffering, to view tragedy as noble rather than simply tragic. We tell ourselves that heroes must suffer to earn their greatness, that pain is the price of glory, that normal human happiness is somehow unworthy of exceptional people. This romanticization of suffering has created cultures that actively discourage contentment and peace in favor of constant striving and perpetual dissatisfaction. The divine manipulation that characterized Greek heroism has its modern equivalent in the social and economic systems that create and destroy our contemporary heroes. Like the ancient gods, our modern institutions promise greatness to those willing to sacrifice everything for success, then systematically destroy those who accept the bargain. The entertainment industry, professional sports, high finance, and politics all operate on the same principle. They identify individuals with exceptional abilities, exploit those abilities for institutional benefit, then discard the individuals when they are no longer useful. The isolation experienced by Greek heroes manifests today in the loneliness of the successful, the emotional emptiness of those who have achieved everything they thought they wanted, only to discover that achievement cannot fill the void left by sacrificed relationships and abandoned values. Modern heroes, like their ancient counterparts, find themselves trapped between worlds, too successful to relate to ordinary people, but too human to find satisfaction in their superhuman achievements. The moral complexity that tormented ancient heroes has only intensified in our interconnected world, where every action has global consequences and every choice affects countless unknown others. Modern leaders face the same impossible decisions that destroyed Odysseus and Theseus: how to serve the greater good while maintaining personal integrity, how to make necessary compromises without losing their souls, how to exercise power responsibly when all power corrupts. The rage that consumed heroes like Achilles finds expression today in the destructive fury of those who discover that the system has betrayed them, that their sacrifices were meaningless, that their achievements have turned to ashes. This heroic rage manifests in everything from domestic violence to terrorist attacks, wherever individuals who believed themselves chosen for greatness discover that they have been used and discarded by forces beyond their control. Perhaps most Tragically, we continue to create new heroes using the same cruel template that the Greeks established thousands of years ago. We identify children with exceptional abilities and subject them to training regimens that sacrifice their childhood, their emotional development, and their capacity for normal human relationships in pursuit of achievement that may never come, or may prove meaningless when it does. We tell stories that glorify heroic sacrifice while ignoring the human cost of heroic achievement. We celebrate those who give up everything for success, while secretly despising those who choose happiness over greatness. We have internalized the Greek message that normal human fulfillment is somehow inferior to heroic suffering, that a life without struggle and sacrifice is not worth living. The gods who tormented ancient heroes may no longer literally exist, but the systems they represented, the cosmic forces that promise greatness and deliver destruction, are more powerful than ever. We live in a world that actively creates heroes in order to consume them, that builds people up in order to tear them down, that promises transcendence while delivering only different forms of human limitation. The true horror of Greek heroism is not that it describes some ancient barbarism that we have outgrown, but that it reveals eternal patterns in human nature and social organization that we have never learned to escape. The heroes we've examined tonight died thousands of years ago, but their suffering continues in every generation that accepts the heroic bargain, supernatural ability in exchange for human happiness, temporary glory in exchange for lasting peace, immortal fame in exchange for mortal love, until we learn to reject the heroic ideal, to value contentment over achievement and happiness over glory. We will continue to create heroes in order to watch them suffer and fall. The myths of ancient Greece are not simply stories about the past. They are prophecies about the future, warnings about the price of greatness that we continue to ignore at our peril. As our journey through the blood-soaked halls of Greek heroism draws to a close, we are left with a terrible understanding. These were not stories of triumph, but warnings disguised as celebrations. Every statue erected to honor these heroes, every poem composed to celebrate their deeds, every story passed down through generations has missed the point entirely. The Greeks were not telling us to emulate these figures. They were showing us the true cost of divine favor and supernatural ability. Tonight, we have witnessed Heracles, the strongest man who ever lived, driven mad by jealous gods and forced to murder his own children before spending his life in servitude to his inferiors. We have seen Achilles choose glory over life, only to discover in death that no amount of fame could compensate for a single day of actual existence. We have followed Odysseus through 20 years of divinely orchestrated suffering, watching him return home as a stranger to his own family. We have observed Jason and Medea destroy each other and their children in pursuit of ambition and revenge. We have traced Theseus's fall from heroic king to exiled failure, rejected by the very people he had tried to serve. Each of these stories follows the same pattern. Exceptional individuals are created by divine intervention, blessed with abilities that set them apart from ordinary mortals, then systematically destroyed by the very forces that created them. The gods did not love heroes. They created them as entertainment, as elaborate toys designed to provide amusement through their suffering and destruction. But the most horrifying revelation of our investigation is not what happened to these ancient heroes, but how their template of suffering has become the blueprint for human greatness in every age since. We continue to create heroes using the same cruel methods, continue to promise transcendence while delivering only different forms of human limitation. continue to celebrate sacrifice while ignoring the human cost of achievement. The heroic ideal has become our most successful method of mass psychological manipulation, convincing generation after generation that normal human happiness is somehow insufficient, that contentment is weakness, that the only life worth living is one of constant struggle and perpetual dissatisfaction. We have internalized the gods' cruelest joke, that suffering is noble, that sacrifice is necessary, that true greatness can only be achieved through the abandonment of everything that makes life worth living. Modern society operates on heroic principles, identifying individuals with exceptional abilities and subjecting them to the same destructive pressures that destroyed ancient heroes. Our entertainment industry creates heroes in order to consume them. Our economic system promises success to those willing to sacrifice everything for achievement. Our political structures elevate leaders only to tear them down when they inevitably prove to be human rather than divine. We continue to tell ourselves the lie that heroes die for something greater than themselves, that their sacrifice serves some cosmic purpose, that their suffering redeems the rest of us from our ordinary limitations. But the truth revealed by Greek mythology is far darker. Heroes suffer and die for the entertainment of forces that view human life as disposable. Their sacrifice serves no purpose beyond providing cautionary tales that we consistently misinterpret. As inspiration, the heroes we have examined tonight were not exceptional because they achieved great things. They were exceptional because they endured great suffering while maintaining the illusion that their pain had meaning. Their true heroism lay not in their supernatural abilities or famous deeds, but in their capacity to continue functioning while being systematically destroyed by forces beyond their control or understanding.